It is high noon in the Valley of the Kings. The year is roughly 1250 BCE. The ambient temperature is 45 degrees Celsius. That is 113 degrees Fahrenheit for the Americans watching. There is no air conditioning. There is no ice. There is no electric fan. The concept of mechanical refrigeration will not exist for another 3 millennia. You are standing on sand that is physically hot enough to blister bare human skin, wearing nothing but a tightly woven linen kilt. And you are about to swing a copper chisel into solid limestone for the next 6 hours. And you are completely fine. Not fine in the sense of barely surviving. Fine in the sense that this is a normal Wednesday. Fine in the sense that you will do it again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Here is the detail that everyone misses when they look at ancient Egypt. We look at the Sphinx, we look at the golden death masks, we look at the towering temples, and we see an engineering miracle. What we never see is the biological miracle happening silently in the background. How do you keep a civilization of several million people alive, working, and building monumentally scaled architecture in one of the most hostile, sun-blasted environments on Earth, without a single watt of electricity? Anybody can stack large rocks if they have enough time and enough hands. But keeping that workforce from collapsing of heatstroke in a desert where a human can sweat out 2 liters of water an hour, that is the actual achievement. The survival equation in ancient Egypt came down to a deeply sophisticated mastery of 3 things: architecture, textiles, and internal chemistry. And by the end of this video, you are going to realize something slightly uncomfortable. The ancient Egyptians solved the problem of extreme heat so flawlessly that we have spent the last 100 years solving it worse. We just do it with more electricity. Let's start with the architecture. Your modern instinct in a heat wave is to turn on a machine that pumps cold air into a sealed box. The Egyptian instinct was to turn the building itself into the machine. Egyptian domestic architecture was built almost entirely from mudbrick. Nile silt, mixed with chopped straw, packed into molds, and baked hard in the very sun it was designed to defeat. There is a nice irony in that. But mudbrick has a specific property that modern glass and steel have completely forgotten: enormous thermal mass. Here is what that means in practice. A thick mudbrick wall does not block heat. It delays it. When the blinding midday sun hits the exterior wall of an Egyptian house, the heat does not pass straight through. It crawls through the dense material slowly, taking hours to make the journey. So the peak heat of the afternoon finally arrives inside your living room at around midnight, by which time the desert night is gone freezing cold, and you actually want the warmth. Then, the cold of the night crawls back through that same wall, arriving inside at midday, right when you are desperate for it. The wall isn't just insulation. It is a time machine for temperature. Nobody in 1250 BCE was writing complex equations about thermal lag or thermodynamics. They simply noticed that thick walls made the house better, and thin walls made it worse. And they built accordingly for 3,000 years. Then they stacked more tricks on top. Windows were small and placed high near the ceiling, because hot air rises, and you want the exit exactly where the heat naturally wants to go. But the masterpiece of Egyptian climate engineering was a feature called the mouth, the wind catcher. If you look at tomb paintings from Thebes, you will see structures on the roofs that look unmistakably like giant scoops. These were hooded vents, angled to face the prevailing northern winds of the Nile Valley. The wind hits the scoop, gets compressed, and is funneled directly down a shaft into the living space below. You have created a pressure difference. You have built a chimney that runs sideways. Passive ventilation with no moving parts and no power source. And then, they did something brilliant. Households would place porous clay jars filled with water directly in the path of that incoming air shaft. The water seeps through the unglazed clay and evaporates off the outer surface. Evaporation takes heat with it. The air arriving in your bedroom has now been actively cooled by passing over an evaporating surface. That is a swamp cooler. That is, in principle, the exact same machine you can buy today at a hardware store for $200. And they built it out of a clay pot and a hole in the roof. If you are finding this interesting, and you want to understand more about the hidden stories behind the world we take for granted, subscribe right now. This channel covers topics like this every single week. And the next section goes somewhere even more unexpected. Let's talk about clothes. Your modern instinct in extreme heat is to wear as little as possible. The Egyptian answer was far more nuanced, and the nuance is the interesting part. Egyptian clothing was almost universally linen, spun from flax. The reason is a stack of material properties that happen to line up perfectly with human biology. Linen fibers are hollow, meaning air moves freely through the weave. It is exceptionally good at wicking, meaning it pulls sweat away from your skin and spreads it across a wide surface area where it can evaporate instantly. Cotton, by comparison, holds moisture directly against the skin. Wool insulates. Linen does neither. In that specific climate, it is the mathematically ideal fabric. But here is the counterintuitive part. Wearing loose, light-colored linen over your body keeps you cooler than walking around bare-skinned. It blocks direct solar radiation from cooking your skin, while still allowing your sweat to do its job. Being entirely naked in the desert sun isn't freedom. It is just a faster sunburn. Which brings us to the internal chemistry. The fluids. If you are working outside in the Egyptian summer, you are losing massive amounts of water. You need to replace several liters a day. The Nile River is right there. But the Nile is also teeming with parasites, silt, animal waste, and pathogens. Drinking straight from the river was a gamble. So the Egyptians drank beer. Vast, civilization-scale oceans of beer. But I need to be clear about what this beer was, because it was not a crisp modern Pilsner. Egyptian beer was thick, low in alcohol, and made from barley or emmer wheat. It was strained, but it was still substantial enough that it functioned closer to a gruel than a beverage. It was hydration. It was calories. It was loaded with B vitamins from the yeast. Crucially, the brewing process involved heating the mash, and the fermentation itself created an acidic environment hostile to pathogens. Beer was, for practical purposes, safer than the water it came from. When we look at the meticulously kept records from Deir el-Medina, the village that housed the craftsmen who built the royal tombs, we see daily rations of multiple jars of beer per worker. In that climate, the beer ration wasn't a perk. It was the cooling system. Cut the beer, and you aren't just being stingy, you are shutting down the internal water supply of men doing heavy labor in a desert. And with that beer came the final piece of the puzzle, salt. When you sweat, you don't just lose water. You lose sodium. Drink all the water you want, but if you don't replace the sodium, your nervous system crashes. The Egyptian diet solved this entirely by accident. Their staple foods were coarse bread, heavily salted and dried fish, and dates. None of this was designed in a laboratory as an electrolyte replacement strategy. Nobody in antiquity was thinking about sodium ions. But a diet built on salted fish, salted bread, and potassium-rich dates, consumed alongside enormous volumes of low-alcohol beer, produces almost exactly the precise fluid and mineral balance required by a human body doing manual labor at 45 degrees Celsius. Here is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. We have been treating the desert as the problem. We have spent this entire video looking at how the Egyptians defended themselves against the heat. But the ancient Egyptians did not survive the desert. They existed because of it. The heat was not an enemy. It was a recruited asset. Egypt was flanked to the east and the west by hundreds of kilometers of lethal, waterless sand. The Red Land. It was functionally a wall. Armies cannot cross it. Supply lines cannot cross it. The desert was a moat that no one had to build, maintain, or pay to garrison. It is the reason Egypt held a continuous, recognizable identity for 3,000 years while empires in Mesopotamia were being conquered and burned to the ground on what felt like a rotating schedule. The absolute dryness of the desert is also the single reason we know anything about them at all. Organic material, papyrus, linen, wood, human tissue, rots in humidity. It survives in dryness. Every scroll in every museum, every painted wooden boat, every mummified pharaoh exists because the climate that made life incredibly difficult made decay nearly impossible. They didn't just survive the heat. They weaponized it. They built an empire inside it. The real question is not whether the ancient Egyptians figured out how to survive the heat. They obviously did. The real question is what it means when we look at a civilization that perfectly optimized its architecture, its clothing, and its society around the realities of its climate for 3,000 years, and compare it to us. There is a house in Egypt, 3,500 years ago. Thick mud walls holding yesterday's cool. A scoop on the roof pulling the north wind down into the rooms. A porous clay jar sweating, taking the heat out of the breeze. Not one part of that requires electricity. Not one part of it will ever break in a way that cannot be fixed with mud and human hands. We have spent the last 100 years solving the exact same problem by putting a plastic machine in a glass window, cooling one room at a time, while the machine dumps its waste heat out into the street, making the city hotter. So we buy a bigger machine. The human body did not change. The sweat glands did not change. The Egyptian at noon in 1250 BCE was running the exact same biological hardware that you are running right now. They just ran it with better architecture and worse beer. If you made it to the end, you are not a casual viewer. You are someone who actually wants to understand the world below the surface, where the real forces operate. Where history isn't just dates and statues, but the relentless, invisible biology of how human beings actually lived. Subscribe now. I will see you in the next one.